What is going on, guys? In today's video I will show you top 6 crazy of the craziest builds in Path of Exile 2 0.4. So we will be taking a look at the builds that are performing extremely well in the current patch. All of these setups have insane damage, strong defenses and smooth overall gameplay. Some of these builds are popular meta choices, while others are more underrated but still incredibly powerful. I'll briefly explain what each build does the best and why it stands out right now, so you can decide which one fits your playstyle. And remember, if you want to be up to date, so check any of these builds, look up the best items, the skill trees and path of building, then check my links in the description. And if you ever played POE 2 for long enough, then you know that the grind for currency can feel endless, and that's where KaidGames comes in. They are a trusted platform used by over 150,000 gamers worldwide. They provide pro player support in more than top 25 games, including POE 2. No matter if you need faster start, help with tough content or just want currency delivered safely and quickly, then KaidGames has you covered. What I really like is how smooth the whole process is, from click to gameplay in minutes, clear and fast chats with their team, plus if an order is not fulfilled, you get an instant refund. So if you wanna skip the grind and enjoy POE 2 your way, then click the link in the description to check them out, and use my code KAID for 10% off. This build exists purely because several mechanics accidentally lined up in a way that absolutely breaks the game and the DPS numbers. This is a true zero-button Autobomber. You walk forward, enemies detonate, your mana instantly evaporates, and then the lightning bolts will chain across the screen. The sparks will fill every corner, and you barely understand why it's happening, but it is going on 24/7. The entire build revolves around infinite trigger loops, which is enabled by the Chore of the Storm, Temporalis Silk Robe, and the airbound staff abuse, also guaranteed critical strikes, and the mana mechanics that are hanging on by a thread. When you make this build work, it will feel completely illegal. Rituals, breaches, and abysses will simply disappear the moment that you enter them. This build is not a league starter, not budget friendly, and not something I would ever recommend to someone trying to progress efficiently. However, this is a god tier build for people who already have currency, they already understand the game, and want to watch their screen explode without pressing a button. We are stacking insane item power here, so airbound staff on the weapon swap, ancestral tiara, the temporalis chest, then the Killjoy gloves, then the Seed of the Catalysm, then the Chore of Storms with a fast metabolist anointment, and even heavy Javel investment just to keep mana alive. So let's take a look at the specifics, and first we have our skill gems. At the core of this setup are two Spark skills. Spark is not here to deal damage in a traditional sense, however it exists purely as a trigger engine. We want as many hits as possible and as fast as possible, and this will guarantee constant critical strikes that proc the Chore of the Storm. Then next we got the Lightning Bolt, which is not manually cast, it is triggered through the Chore of the Storm. Every critical hit will trigger a Lightning Bolt, that bolt will crit, and that crit will trigger an additional effect, and those effects will feed back into the system until your mana is completely drained, but the loop will somehow keep going. Then Arctic Armor is one of the most cursed parts of the entire build, but in this setup the Arctic Armor is a trigger tool. When you are hit, the Arctic Armor procs Airbound Staff on a weapon set too. Once that proc happens, you can swap back to your main weapon and entire loop begins. If you don't care about the zero button gameplay, then easy way to start the loop is also by pressing something at the beginning and then follow the sparks and the bolts. But since the entire point of our build is zero buttons, so the Arctic Armor will become the solution even if it's janky. Then Blink is also mandatory. Auto bombers will live and die by the movement, and Blink allows you to constantly reposition while everything around you explodes. You can of course disable Blink and replace it with something similar if you want, but cast on crit does not work with the triggered spark, so don't try to get too clever here. And lastly, the mana remnants are absolutely required. This build drains mana to zero constantly, and the only reason it does not break itself instantly is because of the mana on kill scaling, Javel investment and duration scaling that keep our engine alive 24/7. Next up, moving on to the passive tree. We specifically made it to support our item abuse, so we want to aggressively path into the critical strike chance and the critical damage bonuses, because Oracle will guarantee crits and the Chore of the Storm will demand them. Our key notables like Aspiring Genius will provide Arcane Surge uptime, which is massive for spell scaling. Then Camaradeer will give raw damage and help to smooth out early loops. Then desensitization is extremely important, both for critical damage scaling and for reducing incoming critical damage, which matters much more than you expect in a dense content. We also pick up the Mighty Eraser to reduce mana cost. This is crucial because every single loop will eat our mana even more. Then Wellspring will become extremely valuable when paired with a Mana Flask tech in the Trusted King Snip setup if you got one. Then Energy Shield clusters are also mandatory. We are not going to be avoiding damage, but on the other hand, we are standing inside the packs and relying on Annihilation as defense. And then Recharge Delay Reduction and Recharge Rate are far more important than the raw life. Also, our skill effect duration is deceptively powerful here. We stack it wherever possible to keep weapon swap effects like the Arctic Armor interactions and triggered skills active long enough to sustain loops. We also want at least 1 or 2 Jevels with 2% mana on kill, otherwise the build feels unstable. And finally, the Jewel sockets are priority here, so Heart of the Well, Controlled Metaphoris against the Darkness, and Sapphire Jewels with the Energy Shield, spell damage and mana on kill will be doing a massive amount of work. For this build, our tree exists just to support the items and not the other way around. This build sits right at the top for off-screen wide clearing speed and absolutely disgusting single target damage, and it does all of this by abusing stack trigger mechanics, life-based casting, and overlapping cold spell interactions that were never meant to scale this hard together. At a first glance, this looks like a traditional Frostbolt setup. You see cold spells, projectiles, crit scaling, and a witch ascendancy, and you might assume it's just another caster. But actually, once the engine turns on, the build reveals what it actually is: a high-speed spell shotgunner that floods the screen with frostbolts during mapping, and then pivots seamlessly into a cast on critical comet setup that deletes pinnacle bosses before they even finish their first animation. This is not a league starter, and it is not a beginner friendly. However, this is actually a high investment and high ceiling build, designed for players who already are in the endgame maps, already have access to strong uniques, and want something that feels both powerful and mechanically interesting. So, we are paying life instead of mana, then instantly leeching it back through the critical hits, then overcapping your life pool with the remnants, and converting all of this life into the raw spell damage and crits through the rapid scaling. When everything is online, the build feels unstoppable. However, when something is missing, it can feel a bit awkward, and this is the trade-off. The goal of this build is simple. While mapping, the Frostbolt coverage and the chaining explosions will wipe entire packs instantly. And then against bosses, the Frost Wall will become a trigger surface, which then rains down overlapping impacts that melt even max difficulty encounters. It's fast, explosive, and extremely rewarding to play once you understand the flow. So, let's take a look at the specifics, and first we have our skill gems. At the center of everything is the Frostbolt. Frostbolt is not just a damage skill here, it's actually a delivery system. Its projectiles, explosions, and interactions are what allow the build to scale into insane territory. When Frostbolt fork, overlap, and explode on grouped up enemies or terrain, each hit will become an opportunity to trigger additional effects and the critical strikes. Supporting that, we use the cast on critical as the backbone of our single target damage. This is how the comet enters the picture, so the comet is never hard cast. Instead, it is triggered repeatedly when Frostbolt and the Frost Wall interactions will generate enough critical hits. Once the comet starts landing, the damage will ramp up extremely fast, because each impact overlaps and compounds with the next one. Then Elemental Weakness is used to strip resistances during tougher encounters and boss fights, which ensures that our cold damage scales properly even against tanky enemies. Then Soul Offering will provide additional scaling and sustain by interacting favorably with our life-based casting and energy shield layers. And then Skeletal Cleric is included not as a damage dealer, but as utility and support to stabilize fights where sustained pressure matters. Then Frostwall is one of the most important skills in the entire setup. It is not for defense here, but the Frostwall is a trigger surface. When the Frostbolt and the Comet collide with it, they will generate repeated explosions and hits in a confined space, which massively increase the number of critical strikes per second. And this is what enables the Comet to chain so aggressively during boss fights. Life Remnant and Mana Remnants are both mandatory, because we are paying life to cast spells and doing so extremely rapidly, so the build relies on a constant recovery. The Life Remnants will allow us to overflow our life pool beyond its normal maximum, while the Mana Remnants will interact with the Archmage scaling and support mechanics to keep damage consistent. And then finally, Archmage itself ties our resource scaling directly into the damage output, which further reinforces this gameplay loop. Next up, moving on to the passive tree, and this entire structure exists just to support life-based casting, critical strikes and the energy shield stacking. You're not building a traditional mana caster here. Instead, we aggressively path towards life, intelligence, critical hit chance, and energy shield nodes that all feed into the rat pit scaling and the blood mage mechanics. Intelligence here is stacked heavily, not just for gem requirements, but because it directly scales energy shield and synergizes with the multiple item affixes. Energy shield nodes are prioritized over the raw life nodes once the core thresholds are met, because the shield acts as their buffer, while life will fluctuate rapidly during the casting loops. Then critical strike chance and critical damage are essential. We want Frostbolt, frost wall explosions and triggered comets to crit as close to 100% as possible. And this is what keeps the instant leech active through the ad-series accuracy and prevents life diffs from spiraling out of control. We also invest into the cast efficiency and recovery scaling when necessary, but majority of sustain will come from ascendancy mechanics rather than the tree itself. Then Javel sockets are also extremely important here. Well-rolled Javels will provide energy shield, spell damage, cold damage and the crit scaling all at once, and skipping them can significantly weaken the build. This setup takes the advantage of one of the most broken ascendancy mechanics in the game, so sacrificing minions for their character stats, and then scaling those stats into the screen-wide damage that deletes everything before it can even see you. This is not a traditional minion build, and it is not a conventional caster either. Instead, it's a high investment, high ceiling monster that converts spirit and sacrificed minions into overwhelming damage output and near constant screen control. At its core, this build abuses the Abyssal Lich ascendancy by stacking enormous amount of spirit, reserving massive numbers of archers, and then turning sacrificed minions into the permanent offensive and defensive bonuses. We are not relying on the minion AI to clear the map for you. The minions exist just to be consumed by empowering you directly, while the spells will blanket the entire screens in overlapping damage zones. And the result is a build that is unstoppable once fully assembled, with damage scaling that most players have never experienced. At the endgame, this build will offer some of the highest consistent DPS in the game, insane clear speed through AoV stacking, and boss damage that makes all content easy. The Abyssal Lich does not negotiate with enemies, it just erases them. So, if you're looking for a build that feels truly different, one that pushes the Path of Exile's 2 systems to their limits, and rewards deep mechanical understanding and investment, then this is it. So, let's take a look at the specifics, and first we have our skill gems. The skill gem setup is where the AoV stacker will come to life, because every single choice will reinforce the same goal, so massive AoV coverage, constant triggering, and scaling damage through the sacrificed minions and the spirit reservation. We are using warp-based mechanics and AoV scaling minions, while reserving an enormous amount of spirit to sustain skeletal archers that exist purely to be consumed for the power. The primary engine of our build revolves around the spell slinger and the cast on elemental element, which allows us to automate large portions of our damage while still actively positioning and controlling the battlefield. Then ball lightning and ice nova serves as the primary AoV damage sources by overlapping repeatedly as enemies are dragged through the stacked spell zones. Lightning warp will play 2 roles here, so both as mobility and a damage booster when combined with the aerial scaling, which allows us to reposition instantly while detonating entire packs in the process. Then Frost Wall is used not defensively but offensively, by forcing enemies to remain inside their overlapping damage fields, while also enabling additional triggers. Then Malice and Siphon elements are combined in together to further boost damage taken by the enemies, ensuring that once something is caught in the area it does not escape. Then on the minion side, the Skeletal Frost Mage, Skeletal Arsonist and the Skeletal Sniper are all reserved primarily for the spirit scaling and the sacrificed interaction. These minions are not meant to survive, their main purpose is to fuel the Abyssal Lich ascendancy by providing raw stats and the multiplicative scaling when sacrificed. The sheer number of reserved archers enabled by the extreme spirit stacking is what pushes this build over the edge. Next up, moving on to the passive tree. We want to build this almost entirely around scaling AoV, spell damage, intelligence and the spirit's efficiency, while picking up key minion nodes purely for sacrifice value, rather than traditional minion damage. This is not a setup that spreads itself thin. Instead, every path is taken deliberately and feeds directly into the build's core loop. At the top of the tree you can clearly see the heavy investment into the AoV clusters, which dramatically increase the size of the ball lightning, ice nova and the lightning warp interactions. These nodes are what allowed the build to function as a true AoV stacker, by turning modest base skills into the screen-wide damage zones. Intelligent stacking will also further amplify this effect by scaling mana, energy shield, and the overlapping spell effectiveness. Then also, we get few minion nodes. We are not scaling minion survivability or attack speed in a traditional sense. Instead, we focus on nodes that increase minion life, spirit efficiency, and effects gained from the minion sacrifice. These nodes will directly translate into the more stats for Abyssal Lich, which makes each sacrificed minion much more impactful. Energy shield scaling is also a major focus, as this build leans heavily into the energy shield for survivability. The larger flat energy shield nodes, recharge rate and faster recharge at the start are all prioritized by ensuring that even in dangerous fights, the build will recover almost instantly after taking even a slight of damage. This setup takes the full advantage of the brand new infusion mechanics by letting us unload insane amount of burst AoV damage while still maintaining off-screen clear speed that feels borderline unfair. This build feels smooth early on, scales like crazy later, and has a god mode energy when it really comes fully online. This is not just your average lightning caster, this is the mana stacking Arc Stormweaver, which is a build that completely rewrites how you think about resources. Instead of mana just being a bar you deplete when casting skills, it becomes the core stat that fuels everything, so offense, defense, sustain. All of these will tie back to one thing, the maximum mana. The more mana you stack, the more devastating Arc becomes, because the harder you shock enemies, the more effective your defenses become. By combining Stormweaver's lightning ascendancy tools with the Archmage scaling and intelligence gearing, this build transforms your blue orbs into the single most important stat in the game. Its chaining clears trash mobs like nothing else, and when combined with the Stormweaver bonuses and the mana scaling, its single target absolutely shreds bosses. Every chain, every crit, every shock is powered by investment that we poured into our mana pool, making the skill feel both satisfying and incredibly reliable. And backing up the arc, we have new infusions. These will let us stack up burst windows where our damage goes into overdrive. And thanks to our mana synergy, we can easily afford it. So let's take a look at our skill gems. At the heart of this build is the arc. It's our bread and butter, our primary source of clear, and the spell that scales directly with our mana stacking approach. The gem supports here are focused on turning arc into a powerhouse. So Archmage is mandatory, converting your massive mana pool into the raw damage. Then you want supports like the spell Echo for the rapid double casting, increased critical damage and the chance for scaling shock multipliers. When you're hitting with the arc under a full set of infusions, it feels like chaining lightning storms across the entire screen. Next is the Orb of Storms, and this is more just a utility button. Orb of Storms will apply consistent shocks and the exposures by setting up enemies that take increased damage, but the real synergy here comes from combining it with infusions, so casting Orb of Storms essentially will prime your rotation, letting you build those infusion stacks that supercharge your arc spam. You just need to place it down before every big fight and watch it boost your damage. Then next we got Mana Tempest, which is a crucial sustain skill. This one keeps your resources topped off and ensures that even in extended fights, you never feel starved for the mana. It creates those burst windows where you can spam arc relentlessly without worrying. You'll learn to time it with your Orb of Storms and the Sigil of Power for the maximum effect. Speaking of which, the Sigil of Power is another gem that fits seamlessly into this build. It gives you an area of strength to fight inside, both by increasing your lightning damage and providing a layer of protection against heavy hits. You can drop it for the bosses or dangerous rares, and it turns those fights into controlled battlegrounds, where you are the one dictating the pace. Now let's talk about the passive tree. The essential psychology here is simple. Stack as much mana as possible, and then let every part of the build flow from that. Nodes that increase maximum mana, both flat and percentage based, are your top priority. Intelligence nodes are also highly valuable, as they boost mana while helping to meet the gem requirements. Once foundation is in place, you can branch into spell damage, lightning penetration and the shock effect nodes. These will ensure that the arc feels deadly in both mapping and bossing. Shock effect in particular is critical because the Stormweaver's ascendancy passives will reward you heavily for applying and scaling shock. The more consistently and powerfully you can shock, the more everything else will snowball. Cast speed is another core investment, because you're spamming Arc continuously. More cast speed not only makes the build smoother, but also increases the EPS by letting you fit more casts into each infusion windows. Then on defensive side, the tree grabs key nodes for the Mind over Matter and the Eldritch Battery, by converting mana into effective mitigation. Life and energy shield clusters are also picked up with efficiency, but our true defense comes from regeneration and recovery scaling. Mana recovery nodes ensure that even after big hits or heavy casting, your resource pool will snap back instantly, letting you keep casting and surviving. Then for cluster jewels and extensions, you want to look for curse effectiveness, lightning area of effect and mana recovery bonuses. These reinforce both the offense and sustain, keeping your build running at a peak power during extended fights. This setup is all about turning your warrior into a walking volcano by scaling Ignite from massive slams and leaving entire packs of enemies burning in your footsteps. If you ever wanted a build that feels heavy, brutal and explosive all at once, then this is it. The heart of this build comes from 3 key skills: Volcanic Fissure, the Forge Hammer and the Stampede. Volcanic Fissure splits the ground open in a wave of lava, then the Forge Hammer lands a crashing blow that ignites even the tankiest targets, and Stampede finishes off by making every step you take rip the battlefield apart. Together, they will give you an unmatched clear speed and boss damage that melts targets. What makes the build shine is setting enemies on fire. Because Ignite scales up the size of your hit, every massive slam you land will translate into a burn that continues to deal damage for several seconds. That means your Forge Hammer or the Volcanic Fissure is just not one hit. It's essentially gets stretched over several times, and the bigger impact, the bigger the burn. The bosses that might usually take ages to grind down will start melting away as you rotate through the skills. And another important thing to know is that while many melee builds were slowed down by the armor explosion nerf this patch, the Fire Warmbringer is still OP. Ignite scaling was not affected by those changes, which makes the setup stand out as most consistent and rewarding warrior build in the game right now. It's super strong for mapping, devastating for bosses, and it feels smooth for the leveling all the way into the red maps. So let's break down the skill gems. And your main clearing tool is the Stampede. And honestly, this is one of the most fun melee skills in Path of Exile 2. Every step you take will proc fissures under your feet, and once you've linked it with the supports like the Crater and the branching fissures, it turns into a chain reaction of eruptions that wipe out monsters without you even needing to stop moving. The mapping feels incredible with this skill, because you're literally killing while stripping through the zones. For single target, you've got a rotation that feels deliberate and powerful, and against rares or bosses, you will start with Infernal Cry if you have access to it, because that weakens enemies and primes them for explosions. Then you slam them with the Forge Hammer, following up by the Volcanic Fissure, and finally you pop Ancestral Cry to boost your exerted attacks. From there, we transition into the Stampede until the targets burn down. If you don't have the Ancestral Cry yet, then you can simply rely on the Infernal Cry to fill that slot, and you will see huge ignite damage rolling over time. Especially for tanky bosses, dropping a War Banner before you start your rotation will add that extra push you need. And one quick tip here, keep your War Banner at a low level. Leveling it up increases dexterity requirements without giving you much more power, so you actually save yourself some stat headaches by leaving it under-leveled. It's still incredibly effective, but you don't need to overcommit points into dexterity just to keep it online. Then for supports, the first place that you want to invest your quality is the Stampede, since that's your main clearing skill and it scales beautifully with the early investment. When it comes to the Jevels, there are 2 things to look out for. The new unique The Jewel Heart of the Will is a game changer by giving you both maximum life on a kill and extra fire damage. Then for rare Jewels, aim for stats like the added rage on a hit, increased damage against enemies with a broken armor, and even the block chance for survival. These will scale your damage while also shoring up defenses, which is the perfect balance for a melee fire build. Then next up we have the passive tree, and you want to start at this section and move into the clusters that emphasize melee damage, slam effectiveness and the Warcry synergies. Since Ignite is our main damage source, so we prioritize the fire multipliers and burning damage nodes, making sure that every big hit we land translates into the sustained burning. Then physical to elemental conversion nodes are also key here, since they let us turn the raw strength into devastating fire output. Defenses are built directly into the progression, so maximum life scaling is everywhere. player, combined with strong investments into the armor and endurance charges. Endurance charges aren't just for defenses, they also tie into the Warbringer synergies and empower your exerted attacks. This keeps you both tanky enough to stay in the melee range and consistent enough to deliver empowered blows every few seconds. The Warcry nodes are another cornerstone of the tree. The cooldown reduction and exerted attack bonus are critical, since our whole single target rotation relies on weaving the Warcry into the slams. By reducing cooldowns and increasing their effect, we make sure that our infernal and ancestral cries are always ready when we need them. There's also room here for scaling AoV, which feels fantastic with the skills like the Volcanic Fissure. Bigger coverage here mean faster map clearing, but it also ensures that your slams reliably ignite every enemy in a pack. This build blends lightning-fast spellcaster gameplay with an automated, screen-shattering comet barrages that create a playstyle that feels fast, explosive, and utterly dominant from the league start and transitioning all the way to the pinnacle bosses. This build looks insane and it delivers. The fire infusion comets will hit like a truck, with massive ignites on top, while cold infusion sparks will chain across the screen for endless clear pressure. The gameplay feels like a traditional spark build, but with godlike benefit of cast on critical procs. And also, we got the triple orb of storms that chain lightning everywhere and permafreeze every enemy in the site to lock them down and delete. Our damage output is off the charts, with the comet shotgun bursts visibly deleting rares and the chunky ubers for 100k plus hits, while the spark chains maintain blistering clear speed in the dense maps. Then defensively, the build is peak tankiness, so Chaos Inoculation with a massive energy shield pull will ignore all chaos, and then we stack on the permafreeze for the cold conversion via the Call of the Brotherhood, and this screen-wide spark coverage will keep the enemy shattered and immobile by giving our energy shield enough time to recharge after big hits. This will complement the energy shield playstyle perfectly, so you tank railguns, then freeze the retaliation, and then recharge to full before the next phase. On top of that, even if the comet misses a beat, your sparks alone will carry the maps and bosses. And this is what makes the build special. We are a pure spellcaster at the heart, with a cast on crit comets as the ultimate force multiplier. So let's take a look at the specifics, and first we have our skill gems. The heart of this build is the perfect synergy between the trigger skills and infusion management, all scaling through the spell damage, critical strikes and the elemental equilibrium keystones for the flipped infusions. Our primary trigger is the spark, supported by the lightning mastery, the rapid casting, projectile acceleration, efficiency and the pinpoint critical. And the recent buffs to the zeniths too will make it a killer swap later, for a massive damage at 90% mana. The spark is very OP, as we could infuse him with the Siphon elements and the EE, which chains off the triple orb of storms for insane coverage and the crit ramp up for 60% base. Then next we got a cast on critical comet linked to the efficiency too, pinpoint critical, raising tempest and the cold mastery, but we can also swap the cold for the zenith post mana fix. This procs fire infused comets on the crits by shotgunning bosses and obliterating groups with over 100k fire and cold hybrids with a huge ignite. We also use no elemental penetration to preserve mana, as we are prioritizing raw DPS efficiency on a budget. Then Orb of Storms triples up with the left click Unleash. Supported by efficiency, consider casting, over Abundance, Unleash and the pinpoint critical. We can also ditch considered for Zenith once the mana flows. These orbs will chain lightning on every spark. Then build your crit meter and generate cold infusions for the sparks blasts. Then next we have the Frost Bomb, which is your infusion engine, supported by the spell cascade, over Abundance, the short fuse and the potent exposure. We just tap it to get exploding fire infusions for the comets, and plus exposure for the chill synergy. On top of it, utility will shine with the weapon swap binds, so we get the Sigil of the Power on the Chiming Staff, which we beef up by magnified area, prolonged duration and the cooldown recovery, for the permanent damage boosts while spending mana. Then Elemental Weakness will share the swap, supported by the Focus Curse, Expanse, Prolonged Duration and the Cursed Ground, or even the Hex Bloom for the speed clear. We usually plan it for set and forget debuffs that apply everything nearby. And finally, Convalescence is your panic button, by instantly kicking Energy Shield Recharge with the prolonged duration and the cooldown recovery. Next up, moving on to the passive tree. This build focuses on scaling spell crit and the ES recharge, while solving mana forever and balancing massive offense with unkillable defenses in the most efficient path possible. The core psychology here is simple. We pump crit to 60% via the 3 nodes, like the careful assassin and controlling magic, and then multiply it through the pinpoint critical and the Malorgris gloves that ignore its downside for the pure crit multi-explosions. From there, we branch into the spell damage, the cold and the lightning scaling, and the remnant pickup for the Stormweaver synergy. So remnants respawn every 3 seconds, which fuels infusions non-stop. Also, energy shield is very important, so chaos inoculation keystone is key. All clusters like the patient barrier, enhanced barrier, and the dampening shield will boost our pull to 8k. Then mana efficiency is also non-negotiable, so get things like efficient casting, conservative casting anoint, and regen nodes that ensure that Zenith 2 will shine without the flasks. The weapon set split is also crucial, so set 1 aka the reds will own damage nodes for the spark, EOS and COC, and then the set 2 aka the greens are utility tools like the curses for the huge AoV. And then we round out our utility with the cast speed, presence, AoV for the orbs, freeze buildup and the shock magnitude with the alternating current. This will cold shock everything thanks to the Shaper of the Storms. Overall, the streak has no bloat here. Every point stat will double down, from physic fragmentation for the extra projectiles, to magnitude amps for the dual and shock chills. This tree is made intuitive, as we transition seamlessly from the Spark League starter, by swapping lightning for the cold crit and the energy shield setup.